We've been talking a lot about these incredible technologies to try and extend life, push back the frontiers of aging. But the question does come up, I think, as you think about this, maybe as you've been thinking about in your own minds, the morality of extreme life extension. What would the world look like if people lived to 110, 120? How do we regulate and think about these new techniques and these breakthroughs? What about the dream of creating a much longer lived society? What are the sort of intersections between science and religion? What cost to all of this in terms of all of these different things? We're going to have a great discussion about this, but to start off, please take a look at this video.
It has been 3 decades since a Hollywood movie asked what it would be like if life could be extended indefinitely.
We'll never be sick, we won't get any older, and we won't ever die.
Since Cocoon turned into box office gold, scientists have made their own alchemy. Medical breakthroughs are making it possible to imagine life well past 100. The headlines are enticing and often confusing. Exercise and a healthy, mostly plant-based diet can extend life, probably by staving off some of the chronic diseases of aging. But somewhat contradictory is research that indicates a near-starvation diet can indeed extend life. Some would say virtually eliminating the pleasure of food, though, may not be worth the extra years. And while consumers spend billions on unregulated miracle supplements, there's ever-growing serious scientific research being done on anti-aging, or longevity extension as some prefer to call it. A number of groups have formed to encourage research into life extension, as well as numerous biotech companies focused on the frontiers of extending longevity. While their approaches vary significantly, their goals are similar: extending lifespan, or as some put it, health span. Most express some variation of, imagine a future in which you age, but without the diseases your parents got, a future in which it doesn't hurt to grow old. Some of the approaches involve pharmaceuticals, from metformin and rapamycin to nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide and sirtuins. Others are taking cellular approaches, aiming at restoring vitality through genome analysis and repair, especially telomeres, removal of senescent cells, or improving the function of cellular organelles. There's also stem cell techniques, allowing young stem cells to talk to, but not touch, old stem cells, which rejuvenates the aging cells. Scientists are working to isolate those revitalizing compounds the young stem cells secrete. Some have even proposed a human version of mouse experiments, where infusions of blood from young mice reversed cognitive and neurological impairments in old mice. That was accomplished by suturing 2 mice together so they shared a circulatory system. Not exactly ready for FDA approval. But as science gets closer to the fountain of youth, troubling issues lurk behind the research. In the movie Cocoon, longevity came with a feel-good policy. A dip in the pool storing alien pods dissolved the aches and pains of aging, and no one seemed to worry about the implications of that longer life. In reality, the possibility of extreme longevity comes with difficult questions about the societal impact of longer lifespans. In a world of limited and unequally distributed resources, who gets to live longer, and at what cost?
We're using up so much of the planet's resources now. We have over 1 billion people in poverty, so just adding more people to the planet by having them live longer is not a good society goal. Having everybody have an increased healthy lifespan increases productivity, and hopefully we can move more into a sustainable kind of living.
As often happens, science is outpacing our ability or even desire to confront the moral, ethical, and societal issues raised by extreme life extension, its effects on the environment, family structure, healthcare costs, and more. If humankind's dream of a long and healthy lifespan is to be a positive development, the time for appraisal is now.
Pretty good introduction, Max. Thank you very much. Please, I'll introduce you to the panel. I think you know most of them already. Rabbi Reichman, Peter, Dr. Collins, Father Austriaco, and Elder Renlund. Thank you so much. Like I said, I'm really been looking forward to this. Where to begin? Rabbi, let me begin with you. Sure. I wrote this down from Genesis. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever. They are mortal. Their days will be 120 years." Wondering if you can give us a little bit of context from the Old Testament to kick us off.
Sure, with pleasure. The desire to live longer is as old as the human being himself, as evidenced by the age-old joke. What does every person hope they will say about him at his funeral? Look, he's moving. My role in this panel is to give us a little historical context, a little religious historical context. And in fact, I suspect many in the longevity field have given thought to the fact that in the Old Testament itself, many of the personalities experienced extreme longevity. Adam lived to 930 years old. And of course, your usual trivia question, how long is the oldest person, was Methuselah, who lived 969 years old. But there's a very interesting observation here. At the times of the flood, the quote that you cited for us actually appears in the context of the flood of Noah. And at that period of time is when God pronounced that the years of man will be 120 years old. What's fascinating is that that did not occur immediately. It took roughly 750 years for the longevity of man to gradually taper down from roughly 900 years old to to exactly 120 years old. Abraham, for example, lived 175 years. The first person who lived that magic 120 was actually Moses. Moses died at 120, and it is after Moses that the lifespan at its maximal was actually 120 years old.
Everyone else was great-grandfathered in, apparently.
But there's a very interesting thought from a contemporary scientist in Israel, Dr. Natan Aviezer, who claims that what's the reason it took a number of generations for the longevity to decrease from roughly 900 years to 120. He claims that God, at that point in history, introduced the genes to curtail longevity. And it took a couple generations for it to penetrate. And why is that so important? That's so important because this conference is about genetics and longevity, and it could perhaps be that we are attempting to identify those genes that God introduced at that stage of history and now reverse it to achieve that longevity again.
Well, thank you for that. That's great. Lots to dig into there. And I was going to go to Peter next, but I think that was such a perfect tee up for you, Dr. Collins, the idea of introducing genes to actually curtail our longevity. If you wouldn't mind as well, as part of your answer, if you could give the audience just a couple sentences about your background. They obviously know you as the head of the NIH, but maybe a little bit about your personal background, if you can.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. And Sanjay, you've been doing a lot of work this morning. Thank you for taking on this topic with us. I'm a physician, a human geneticist. I'm also a Christian. I basically had the privilege of leading the Human Genome Project, which read out the DNA instruction book that we're now about to talk about in terms of whether God inserted some genes in there that limit the human lifespan. And now, as the director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States, I have a chance to look over the entire landscape of biomedical research in the US and across the world and try to be sure that we're investing the maximum amount of resources into the places that hold the greatest promise for relieving human suffering. And certainly the area of aging research is a prominent area of interest. We now have a new term called geroscience, which is the science of aging, which refers to everything from trying to understand the lifespan of simple organisms like yeast or roundworms, all the way to understanding what it is with humans that doesn't just promote a particular lifespan, but particularly a health span. And I think that's what many of us are interested in, maybe even more than wanting to live to 130. It's how healthy am I going to be? And if you can offer me the chance to have a health span that's pretty good, then I'll take you up on that. In terms of the genetic story, we do know that longevity has genetic contributions. It tends to run in families. I'm happy to notice that since both my parents died at age 98. Wow. And I hope to be able to achieve that if I don't crash my motorcycle into a tree in the meantime. because you got to watch out for those trauma things. They don't necessarily pay attention to your genes. So what we've learned about longevity, though, is pretty dramatic in simple organisms. And particularly, I want to refer you to what's been done in the roundworm, C. elegans, where research has shown that there is a limited set of genes that determine the lifespan of that little wriggly creature. And that with an appropriate manipulation of those genes, you can cause those worms not just to be a little longer in life, but maybe as long as 4 or 5 times their normal lifespan. Imagine applying that to humans. Some of those, I knew Peter would like that part. Some of those same genetic factors turn up in other organisms. We certainly have identified ways to help mice live longer than their normal lifespan by genetic manipulations. And in humans, now that we've really started to look at the genes of what you might call extremely long-lived persons, centenarians, there are clearly genetic variants that you find in that group more frequently than you would in a random collection of people. And some of those turn out to be the same genes that have turned up in the roundworm, something like FOXO, for instance, which is a gene that has such a lovely name and is also clearly very important in the aging process. So as we begin to understand that, I think we are also understanding that aging is not just a running down of the system. It is a programmed process. And evolution probably had an investment in having the lifespan of particular species not go on forever. You've got to get the old folks out of the way so the young ones have a chance at the resources. So the idea that we might be able to fool around with that it sounds more appealing. It's not as if this is an inevitable wearing down of the system. One more quick story. My lab studies one of the most dramatic human genetic conditions called progeria, which is an acceleration of the normal aging process. These kids who appear normal at birth age at about 7 times the normal rate and die at age 12 or 13 of heart attacks or strokes. And they look like little old people at that point, even though their intellectual development is entirely normal. If anything, it's precocious. We know exactly what the genetic glitch is in those kids. It's 1 letter out of place out of the 3 billion letters of the DNA instruction book. And we know enough about it to have actually initiated clinical trials. And just 2 days ago, published in JAMA, was the first report that one of those clinical trials had led to life extension in those kids, which is very reassuring, although it's certainly not a cure. And interestingly, the latest trial that has just gotten started and is underway right now is actually using a drug which is the same class of drugs that has extended normal lifespan in mice called rapamycin, and maybe will turn out to be something of interest for humans as well. So studying these rare examples where aging has really been accelerated may teach us something pretty important about the normal process in all of us. Genetics has a lot to offer, but there's a lot more than genetics to talk about here.
Terrific, thank you. Peter, I think you'd agree that health span is obviously important, but my sense is from talking to you that you're talking about more than that. You're talking about radical life extension.
So yes, of course it's health span. I watched my father at age 87 suffer from vascular dementia, and living in that state is not living. So what we all desire is healthy extended life. How long? First of all, Rabbi, this 120-year, I feel cheated. Well, I think, actually, the fact is the majority of the human population doesn't make it to 90 or 100. So 120, if that's the contract, we're being shortchanged on this. The question, this panel was sort of first phrased as the morality of immortality, and I would almost flip it maybe to say the immorality of mortality in some ways. Or the unfairness thereof. I want to hit a point I think is very important, which is morals change over time. And if I could give a few examples of this, or morals and ethics, if you would. I think about the fact that I'm Greek by origin. If I've gone back 1,000 years to my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and if he had had some kind of a cardiac syndrome that required a transplant, and I went to someone who had just passed away from being gored by a bull and took that person's heart and transplanted my great-grandfather's heart, that would be sort of being burned at the stake of taking a dead man's heart and transplanting it. Today, it's a miracle. In the same way, surrogate pregnancy would have been thought of something that would not be accepted. So morals change over time, or ethics change over time, and I think we're going to be forced to deal with that on extreme longevity here. A couple of additional thoughts. I remember when I was in medical school, I saw this show on extreme lived sea life, that certain species of whales, turtles, sharks could live hundreds of years, theoretically as long as 700 years. And I remember thinking, if they can, why can't we? And being an engineer, I thought it's either a hardware or a software problem. And we're finally at a point where we're starting to be able to understand what that is. I think what is special about today is that we have the wealth and the science to begin to interrogate what is going on there. And whether it's within the labs of governments or private institutions, we still can't take it with us. And I guarantee you that there's a huge amount of capital that's going to go into investigating how do we make it longer. My friend Ray Kurzweil, who's my co-founder of Singularity University, talks about something called longevity escape velocity. And it's this notion that there will be some point in the future that for every year we live longer, science is extending our life for more than a year. And that's an interesting thought. And the question is, when is that going to be? Ray's prediction is that's 10 or 12 years from now. So I think about that, the fact that my 2 7-year-old boys who are here with me have the potential for a potentially indefinite lifespan, that the technology that they're going to be intercepting during this exponential growth that we're facing right now is extraordinary. Can we extend past 120? Can we go indefinite? I think we're going to find that out over the next few decades. I don't think it's going to be something we'll discover 50 or 100 years from now. I think it's the next 20 or 30 years that big data, quantum computing, genomics, all of these things are going to come together to give us some kind of understanding. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, and that's terrific. And we want to come back to what that means certainly for the world, for the planet, which I think you were starting to allude to.
Can I just add one thing on that point, which is it's very important to think about, are we going to drive ourselves towards overpopulation? Bill Gates gives a couple of great TED Talks that says there are 2 things that reduce population growth rate pressures. Make a society healthier and better educated, they go into negative growth rates. A large number of my friends in Silicon Valley are worried about underpopulation of planet Earth, not overpopulation. That will peak at 9.5 or 10 billion, but as AI and robotics is giving us better healthcare, better education, we'll go into a negative growth decline.
Yeah, and there's been some evidence of that, I think, what you're describing already around the world.
And you'll blow up Social Security, of course.
Yes. But Dr. Collins, I think if I asked people at the peak of their earning capacity at age 65 or 70, are you ready for retirement? The answer from most people I know is no. I mean, are you ready for retirement? I hope not. And so it could be that extending human lifespan 10, 20, 30 years is the biggest boom for GDP of nations ever if we move the retirement age.
Yeah, we weren't sure we were going to get into federal entitlement reform in this panel, but we've already gone there. Father, there's a lot of things that have been brought up, but one of the things Peter just said is that our morality has changed. What we accept in terms of the intervention to extend life has changed over time. A heart transplant would have been seen as something almost demonic in the past. What are your thoughts on that?
So 25 years ago, I joined the laboratory of Lenny Guarenti to get my PhD, and we decided at that point to explore the possibility that there are genes in budding yeast, and that it's wonderful to have seen how it has changed in 25 years. But I am a priest today because during my graduate school, I encountered Jesus Christ, and it changed my life. And within a year after graduating my doctorate, I had resigned my position and entered the seminary. And what is so striking about this is, I know I will live forever. See, in this conversation as a Christian, I know I will live forever. I will see the end of the universe, and yet I must die. So extreme longevity. In the Christian scheme of the world, extreme longevity involves the resurrection. It involves that I will rise from the dead. I will have a body that will allow me to do things that physicists think are incredibly weird and crazy. And that body will never die. And so it's so striking that in a conversation about this, I am deeply aware of the science. The sirtuin field has captivated me as I watch my PI get bigger and bigger, and yet I am a priest today because I wanted to live forever, and I know I will. And so if we ask about the morality of living forever, the question really revolves about what kind of forever life are we thinking about, right? Because the kind of life that we're discussing here is a life of the same. 1,000 years of the stuff we're doing today. But the Christian gospel says that life forever involves a transformation, that I have to change in order to live forever in a way that will radically alter my relationship, not only with my parents, but with the people around me. That more of the same, it's not that it gets boring, but it will always involve suffering. And that if we want to live forever without suffering, the Christian gospel would basically say it's more than genes. It's more than rapamycin, or it's more than Tor. It's actually a radical transformation of the spirit. And so with regards to the ethics of aging, I think that there are so many questions when I get involved in conversations in the Catholic Church surrounding lifespan extension. There are clearly lots of questions. But at the very end of the day, the Catholic priest will have to say, but there is more. There is more than 1,000 years of this. And the question is, are we forgetting that? Are we being tempted to forget that because we are so focused on what is here? And so I think that's my response to the ethics. It's a much bigger question about whether or not it's right or wrong. It's more of what can we imagine? The imagination, the Christian imagination, talks about a lifespan that exceeds the age of the universe. And I don't know if anything we can do today will ever do that.
I think even Peter would agree with that, I think.
There is uploading, but we won't talk about that.
That'll be for the end of the conversation. Elder Renlund, first of all, I want to give you a chance to respond to it because we've obviously said a lot already. But let me also ask you this. If we think about aging in a way that we skip or stall senescence, then we really prolong aging. Does life take on less meaning? I mean, does it seem to have more meaning because we have this period of time, we have a rough idea of what that period of time is likely to be? Does life itself, for humans, take on less meaning if we start to radically extend it?
First of all, related to some other comments, I think that man's ethics and moralities can change. But trying to discern what God's ethics and morality are doesn't happen by voting. It happens by discerning His will. And the real radical life extension is just as the Father explained, death and resurrection to something different. And that the idea of being away from deceased ancestors forever isn't heaven to me. So there is something important in what was said. I do think that the idea that some people use to counter ethically research into life extension is that life then is different, in that nobody then, knowing the end point, will not be motivated to change during this lifetime. And that's buying into the notion that deathbed repentance is the right way. And that's completely wrong. It's choosing early on to follow a path that God has laid out for us. That's what brings joy in this life and in the life to come. So that, for instance, for me to learn and promise my wife that I'm going to be faithful early on brings me joy in this life and in the life to come. I don't have to philander my whole life and then just when I approach death, that last seagull dive, say, okay, dear, I'll be faithful now. Because I think that's flawed thinking. because it's living the life that God has outlined that brings joy in this life and in the eternities.
I think I know how you'll respond to this question based on what you've just said, but you're a cardiologist. You work with heart transplant patients. The issue of patient selection must have come up, and it must have been one of those at times, I imagine, ethically challenging and difficult decisions that had to be made. Is there a parallel here with regard to radical life extension, the idea of selection?
We face a challenge in the healthcare system already today, and that is that wealthy people get better care. And that happens day in and day out forever. And if you said, let's take the money we spend on heart transplantation and use it for vaccinations, and wouldn't that be better? Well, in terms of life saved, yes. But we have that happening now. And so that's likely to continue. So if wealthy people want to fund this kind of research, we should let that happen. There's no problem. Because I think as we focus on life extension, if that turns out to be something very worthwhile in and of itself, terrific. But if it isn't, it likely will affect the age-related diseases that can develop. So something good is probably going to come, and I think those who have the means will be pursuing it. But I think eventually everybody could benefit from it.
I want to make sure people can respond to each other here, because again, there's a lot coming up, and if you want to do that, and then I have a question for you as well.
So I think this concern about the disparity between life extension and health extension, I'm not so worried about it. I think they will co-evolve. I think as the life extension research expands, so will the health extension. But I also believe that, just to get a little perspective, I don't think this conference would have been held, and I'm not sure why, in 100, 200 years ago when the lifespan was 40 years old or 30 years old. They didn't have a conference saying, could we extend our lives to 50 with vaccination and organ transplantation and the developments, or even a few decades ago, could we extend from 50 to 60 or 70? So I don't really see a fundamental difference here. I believe that however long we live, we'll continue to live with meaning. We'll continue to live, if we are religious in our beliefs, we will maximize those religious beliefs with all the amazing technologies in terms of being bored for your life. We will, believe me, have plenty of entertainment opportunities. So I'm not really as concerned, especially because it's going to be sort of a gradual evolutionary process. We've adapted very well to our current life extension. I think if it proceeds in a stepwise fashion, we'll continue to evolve and progress as we did in the past.
Peter, I'm curious, what motivates your thinking on this? Is this one of those situations, because you've obviously been involved with lots of very innovative work. Is it the idea that it can be done, that it should be done? How do you think about it?
Well, there's a number of things driving it. I think my earliest drive was I'm passionate about opening the space frontier, and NASA is very slow. And I figure if I live longer, I'll have a chance to intercept more technology and get out there. That was an early sort of youthful point of view. But I think it's one of the most exciting areas ever. I love my life. I love the world we're living in. Every day is more exciting than yesterday, and I want to see more of it. I don't think boredom is part of my near-term perceived future. And so that's part of it. I think it's also, as an entrepreneur, it's a huge marketplace. That's not on its own a decent enough rationale, but it is part of the business opportunities of how do we create health and longevity. It's just, for me, it's one of the most exciting places of convergence of all of these technologies today.
Do you have a point of view on life-saving therapies near the end of life?
Yeah, I think that I'm not for extreme events at the end of life that would cause pain to the patient. I watch my
What if
father.
they don't cause pain, though? I mean, aside from that sort of
So,
thing.
I mean, one of the questions, for example, is what do you think about Alcor and companies like that, in which at the end of life, you are frozen, either your brain or your body, because it's anticipated that nanotechnologies will enable us to restore a person physically. The fact is we're moving very rapidly. I mean, the technologies we have at hand today in terms of molecular biology, heading towards nanotechnology, AI, coming together. We are nanomachines right now, right? A virus, a cell is a nanomachine. We take a seed and we drop it into the soil and we water it, and the instruction set and the molecular machinery grow this mighty oak. That's extraordinary. And so the question is there a boundary condition for science and engineering that limit us? Or will we be able to understand what's really there and begin to tinker with it? I mean, this is a fundamental question. As an engineer and a scientist, I say there isn't, and yes, we will be able to, and yes, I'll be able to get in and find out why. I mean, let's face it, the selfish gene, biology, has no use for us after reproductive age. And so again, for most of our history, at age 26, we become a grandparent, right? We had a child when we went to puberty at age 13. At age 26 or 27, 28, we're now a grandparent. And the worst thing we could do was steal the food from our grandchildren's mouths, because that would not perpetuate the species. This is before McDonald's and Whole Foods and all the food abundance came into existence. And so the best thing we do is give our bits back to the environment. But now I don't agree with that. I think the ability for me to add and contribute to society adds to society, and as a positive externality there.
So let's talk about this potential then of how we might actually understand our own brain's function well enough to preserve it. You mentioned the idea of freezing individuals in hopes that that could be utilized to bring them back to full consciousness in the future. And certainly there are people talking about downloading one's consciousness even before you're dead in order to have a copy of yourself, or maybe the only real copy, functioning in silico. Those make for really interesting discussions. We at the moment are invested in something called the Brain Initiative around the world, the US part of that now ramping up to about $400 million a year, having recruited a whole bunch of engineers and robotics experts and computational experts to try to figure out how the 86 billion neurons between your ears do what they do. And this is an enormously challenging and interesting problem, because each one of those neurons on the average has maybe 1,000 connections. So if you start thinking through the complexities there, that is, as far as I can tell, the most complex structure in the known universe. And we aim over the next 10 years to try to at least get a pretty good idea about how the circuits in the brain do what they do, but I'm not sure how far we will get in that timetable. Which makes it hard for me to understand then how in that kind of timetable that maybe Ray Kurzweil talks about, or maybe you do, how could we in the space of only a decade or so be at a point where we could legitimately claim we could not just measure that and occasionally watch what happens in real time by appropriate non-invasive technology, but we could actually download it into some other structure to the point where one could say that person's consciousness is now represented in silico. Help me think this through.
Sounds pretty hard to do, yeah.
So first of all, I'm not going to, the work that I'm doing in terms of longevity with Celularity and human longevity and Fountain is not in that area. It is in the how do we extend the healthy human lifespan an extra 20 or 30 years with the intention of intercepting additional technologies. The idea of uploading yourself into silica or...
you said up and I said down.
Well,
significance.
we're here at the Vatican. Up, I think, is the appropriate direction.
I don't know what Father Nick would say. Maybe he'd call this down.
But I don't think there's any credence to a 10-year time horizon. But let's say it's 20, 30, 50 years. The question is it ever possible? And if it is possible, is that something we should strive for? And at the end of the day, yeah, 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion synaptic connections, and then not even understanding the fundamentals. Is it microtubules causing, are we a quantum computer? Are we a receiver? What are we? How do we function? I mean, we don't have the very fundamentals of how the brain works yet. I completely agree from that. And that makes it exciting to try and find out.
Father, what do you think? I mean,
so I'm going to make 2 points. The first, I think, is I think I can still affirm that it's incredibly important that we do the research that will enhance health span and even reasonable extension of lifespan. Because I think it's really important that we do all that we can to help those who are older have a fuller life. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing is I'm just intrigued by the whole notion of uploading or downloading one's consciousness to machine, and therefore say that we are therefore that machine. There are philosophical reasons why this would be controversial, but last night I had an amazing dish of carbonara. When I come to Rome, I have carbonara, and I think that there's something bodily about the human experience that even if our consciousness was simply uploaded or downloaded onto a computer, the fact that I would never be able to experience a carbonara, or for even better, like a cold glass of water after a long run. There are things about the experience of the body that are so intimately tied to what it is human, that it is hard for me to imagine what it would be like to be a disembodied consciousness that is not able to feel, right? To feel, and not just to feel as in emotions, but to embrace someone, to kiss someone, to be held. That to me is so human that if we are able in the future, which like I said, I think is disputed, that we could upload our consciousness into this incredibly large frame supercomputer, that I would doubt if that's me. It would be something, it would have, whatever it is, it would have my thoughts, it might have my memories and my capacity to think, but it wouldn't be able to kiss someone. It wouldn't be able to taste blue M&Ms. I mean, there's just something, there's something incredibly human about the body, and that's why that's my only concern, is that dream is actually to deny the incredible importance of the human body, and that the human body is an integral component of what it means to be a human being.
But of course, all of those sensations of a hug, of an enjoyable meal, are all electrochemical signals in the neocortex. The question is, and right now there's probably $1 billion a year going in at DARPA, at Facebook, at Neuralink, at what's Brian Johnson's company, Kernel, going into brain-computer interface work, right? So how do we interface your neocortex with the cloud? And then it starts to become fun, right? When I can increase my memory, my intelligence, because I upload to the cloud. I mean, this device is getting most of its functionality from the cloud, not from the computational power on here. I don't put it past our abilities to do that. The plasticity of the brain is a beautiful thing.
Elder Renlund, as far as questions I never thought I'd ask at the Vatican, is having a human body essential to being human?
It is. But I think, if I may, I think that it's unnecessary to speciously polarize this debate, because this kind of research, there is no ethical reason to stop it. Because, as was mentioned by Rabbi Reichman, this is likely to occur slowly, gradually. We might have this LES thing that happens, but it's likely to happen. And if we, in the process, extend health span so that the likelihood of living well longer, everybody should be very happy with that. And the adjustments will be made. And if this actually slowly over time makes it so that we have more people that live to 120. Right now, as I understand it, there are only 36 people on Earth that we know are older than 110. 36. Only one is a man. 18 are Japanese. But if we have more people living into that age range, but with excellent function, I think everybody's going to be pleased. There's no ethical concern there. I think it's as we get to these other things that there's a tendency to really try to say we're dealing with some dichotomy and have a speciously polarized debate.
But it is a worthwhile pursuit, though, do you think, what Peter's talking about? The more moderate life extension, the health span, I think most people would agree.
Yes.
But the more radical life extension, for all the reasons that Peter's talking about, the fact that they may have these ancillary benefits, even short of radical life extension that we get.
I don't think there's an ethical reason to tell him stop. And I don't think as a society we would tell him to stop.
Can I ask a question, actually? So one of the assumptions that I've been hearing is that this is going to be a gradual evolution. And yet, from the kind of technologies that I'm aware of, for even just pharmacological interventions, for example, these are still, at the initial anyway, going to be incredibly expensive and pricey. So I guess I'm concerned that what's going to happen is a small subset of the human population is going to have access to this technology. And then they and their children are going to be able to go from 90 to 120. And so within a couple of generations, you're going to have a certain subset living to 120, while the rest of us are still living to 80 or 90. So I don't know how gradual that may be. I could be corrected on this, but if it's going to be expensive, then how are we going to be able to make it gradual in such a way that 8 billion people, which is what 8 billion people will have equal access to this technology, such that over time, large groups of people are going to be able to live longer.
May I ask, or may I just mention, I agree with that concern. However, I lived 5 years in sub-Saharan Africa, and in some of our countries, median life expectancy was 38 years, contrasted with the United States, which was in the upper 70s. We were dealing with that kind of discrepancy and somehow ignoring it. So I think not ignoring it is a good thing, and I think paying attention to it is a good thing, but somehow we suffer through it now.
Yeah, I want to agree with that perspective, but it does carry a weight of responsibility on all of us that you do not become complacent about the difference in health experiences from those who have resources versus those who do not. And yet at the same time, if you want to see advances in health occur in Africa, they have to start somewhere, and oftentimes they start in the countries that have the resources. If we want to see health span extended by such things as, for instance, figuring out how to provide your own organ transplant when your heart has failed or your kidney has failed, which is a path we're on right now to figure out how to do that using stem cell approaches and 3D tissue printing, as opposed to waiting on a donor that may or may not be there for you by the time you need it. That's a very exciting field, and one that I think has enormous potential, and many of us working quite hard on making it real. At the same time, it will be prohibitively out of reach, at first anyway, except in countries that are the most advanced. But ultimately, if that is successful, one would demand to see that it also become accessible to others. I worked for a while as a volunteer physician in a missionary clinic in Nigeria, and I was very troubled at first by the difference in health experiences that I saw amongst the patients that I was taking care of there compared to what I would see in the United States. But I also realized that the advances that had happened in Nigeria, the accessibility to simple drugs to treat heart failure, for instance, had only happened because somebody invested in them first in the developed world, and then they did find their way into other places. But it's our responsibility, folks, to accelerate that pathway and not to be in any way complacent. Otherwise, we are guilty, I think, of falling into a trap of being blind to principles of justice and equity, and that we cannot do.
That's a great message. Thank you, Dr. Collins. Yes, please.
And the example you gave is a perfect one. We have Dr. Rothblatt here from United Therapeutics that's doing just that, 3D printing lungs and looking at 5 or 6 different ways towards the future of transplantable organs. The reality is all technologies begin very expensive, and the wealthiest people buy them when they work the worst, right? You can think of the early Wall Street banker
here,
with a
Peter, careful.
suitcase cell phone that's paying $1 million for that cell phone, and then by the time it actually gets perfected, the price is cheap, and now we have 1 billion handsets in Africa, where a child in the middle of Kenya with barely enough to eat has access to all the information that Larry Page at Alphabet has, right? It's demonetized, dematerialized, and democratized access. And so this is the curve that we are always on. And I completely agree we need to be clear about this divide, but people talk about this rich-poor divide. I want to be clear, it's not about have and have-nots. It's about creating a world of haves, and yes, there'll be a few super haves, but a world in which every man, woman, and child has access to all of these health, water, energy, all of these things is a great world we should strive towards. And ultimately, if we pay the price early and do the work and get access when, maybe kind of iffy, that's a decent trade.
Rabbi?
I also just want to sort of frame that the challenge we have in the 21st century, give it a little historical context. So in the times of Copernicus and Galileo, for example, we talked about the relationship of the Earth to the rest of the universe. A couple hundred years later with Darwin, we focused on man in man's relationship to the rest of the creatures on the Earth. Today, our focus is the very definition of humanity. What defines a human being? Mm-hmm. We've never discussed that before. We have brain uploading or downloading. We have splicing animal DNA into human beings. We have people experimenting with head transplants. We have people experimenting with organs. I mean, it's quite possible that maybe not now, but in a few years' time, there'll be people sitting in this room that have more than half their body that they weren't born with. Either transplanted organs or 3D printed organs. At what point do you no longer become yourself? At what point do you become somebody else? At what point is humanity still humanity? And that's the issue we're going to have to address with all these technologies. That's an issue which requires much further thought.
Just before we move on here, I'm curious with the panel, and I'll ask the audience as well. How many here on the panel would want to live to, say, 250 years old? Not as many as I thought. Peter, does that surprise you?
So it's interesting, right? I do find that fascinating, and fine, those of you who don't want to, you don't have to.
All right.
For you, Dr. Collins, why not?
I was very taken by what Father Nick said as a Christian, as somebody who thinks about the fact that the time we spend on this earth is a momentary blink of existence on a much more eternal scale. The idea of focusing entirely on this part of what it means to be a child of God seems to me to miss a really important point. So I think the idea of carrying this on for another extra 150 years, delaying what might be a much more wonderful experience, doesn't necessarily add up to, I want to do that.
Can I? So I've worked as a chaplain at New York Cornell Presbyterian and MSK on the Upper East Side for many months before I moved to my current position. And so I've accompanied many people who have died. I've helped them to die. And because of my research with the Guarenti Lab, we would have many conversations about extending lifespan. And I've discovered that there are really two groups of people out there. At the end of their life, I've met a lot of people who said, my life is full. I've lived a full life. I'm ready to go. And then there are others who say, my life is not full. I still have much to do. And then and I'm not happy with where I am. And what I've discovered actually, and there was this one conversation, I was speaking to one patient and there was a double bed. So the other patient turned to the patient I was talking to and he said, well, what do you think another 100 years is going to give you? Like, if you haven't figured out how to live a good life in 80, do you think another 100 is going to change that? And it got me thinking about how, is it really quantity or quality? Now, I really appreciate your point where, you know, you are such a passion for life and you have such a passion for tomorrow. And that's a great gift that you received. But I know a lot of people, there's a lot of suffering and tragedy in the world. And I've known a lot of people who do not know how to deal with that suffering and who do not know how to deal with that tragedy. And so an extra 200 years in their minds is not as attractive as it may be for you. And so I think when I look around at people, when I talk to people about this, a lot of people will tend to focus on quality. They'll say, look, I know I've got my 80 years, 90, 70 years, 80 for those who are strong, according to the Psalms. And I'm going to do the best that I can with that. And that limited period actually shapes and gives meaning to the life that they're going to live. And an extra 250 may, for some, I think, just simply give them an extended version of that. For a lot of people, it's like someone said to me, there's 24 hours in a day, and I've got to deal with that. And there's a sense that the lifespan is also something like that.
Elder Renlund, I don't think you raised your hand for the 250 years, but I'm curious, how do you reconcile working as a cardiologist, helping extend life, transplant patients, with views on life extension? I mean, it is a form of life extension, obviously, for people who would have otherwise not survived.
A religious way to look at it is that in Isaiah, we see that King Hezekiah was told he was going to die by a prophet of God, and then his time was up. And then he prayed, and God told Isaiah to go and tell him he had another 15 years. And so that doing reasonable things to extend life is perfectly normal to try to achieve what the Father just said. Mormons believe in eternal progression, that we actually came to this world to obtain a body, to have experiences, to progress. And we believe that that progression continues eternally, even after death and after resurrection. And so, in much the same way that Dr. Collins mentioned, I'm not sure that I would choose to exit now, but I'm not sure I'd choose to stay 250 years from now. I think it is that this life is but a small moment in an eternity. And I think I'm grateful that I actually think it will be a gradual extension of health span and maybe some lifespan, but that the real radical life extension that some people speak about without death, that's not something I would choose to do, because part of God's plan includes death, resurrection, and then going through the eternities in a different role.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And we're running out of time, but Peter, I feel like maybe you've been ganged up on a little bit in this panel. So
I have to say I'm extraordinarily grateful for the points of view here. I find them really open and generous and positive towards this. Right? There's no question that an extended, healthy life, whether it's biblically 120, I think the world would be so amazingly grateful for being able to even reach that. And for those who want to continue, if there's the option, I mean, I want to go walk on Mars. I want to go see other star systems. These are things that, as the child inside me, so much wants to do. But perhaps it's an option we have. I'm happy to deal with healthy, extra 30 years for the moment, and then deal with more than that down the road.
I think we're going to leave it at that. Thank you very much. I told you to be entertaining and engaging. Please, thank you, panel. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it.